Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on history. And today we are talking about something that is extremely critical to the philosophy of history, conceptualization of history, and this is about time and history. Of course, this interaction is split into two parts, part 1 and part 2. In the first part, we shall try to understand the implications of the definition of time, the way it has been conceptualized, conceived, understood at different points of time in the modern context. This relates to several scientific changing perspectives also. And then, of course, we all know that time is so critical to understanding of history. So, its pertinence to history, conceptualization of history, philosophy of history, and also the modern history writing, the way it began in India. So, the colonial period or the oriental flavor of history writing that we witnessed across the last quarter of the 18th and the 19th centuries, and also the early part of the 20th century. So, what all followed as implication of this conceptualization of time, the cultural notion of time. For example, there is nothing absolute about time. It has been visualized, it has been conceived by different societies at different points of time differently. Different religions that delve into the origin issues, origin of beings and so forth, have visualized time differently. So, if you look at Hinduism, if you look at Christianity, if you look at Islam, so there is fair degree of difference, the way it has been conceived over a period of time. And then we have across the 17th century, 18th century, scientific revolution and so forth, we have a different definition of time vis-a-vis science, right? And within science also we have changing paradigms. We have Einstein coming over in the early decades of the 20th century, and he gave a completely different meaning to time, completely different understanding of time that is somewhat counterfactual, not easy to comprehend, but its pertinence to history writing, of course, would follow, and they are very much there. So, we shall try to track particularly in the second part of lecture the pertinence of this this clash of chronology as Trotman has spoken of between the Western or the Christian understanding of time and the Indian understanding of time or Hindu understanding of time. So, those are the things that we would be talking about in today's lecture, split into two parts. So, let's begin with something very basic, and let's ask to ourselves, what is time, right? So, when we ponder over this, of course, we all are given to understand through our textbook understanding of measurable phenomena, right? So, time as one of the three fundamental entities that are measured. We all know we measure length, or you can think of space, length, width, height and so forth. So, that is measured. We all know this. We also measure mass, right? So, mass is also measured, the magnitude of mass is measured, and we all know. And then the third aspect that is very fundamental to all the entities that we get to see is time, and time also we all know is measured, right? However, unlike the other two, that is length and mass, time, as you would understand, is intangible. It's not out there to be measured from one end to the other the way we do with respect to space or length or with respect to mass, right? We weigh it and we understand its magnitude, but something like that cannot be done with respect to time, because it's just not there. It's not a thing. It does not have length, width, height or mass itself, and it has to be measured completely notionally, right? So, Time cannot be defined in absolute terms, unlike the other two, and it is an expression at best. What do we do? How do we define it? So we have watches, we have several light years, we have astronomical years, we have different units by which we tend to measure time. But when we think of it as to what it is, we are measuring it all right, but what itself time is, then we find that it cannot be defined in any absolute terms, and at best it is, as you can see on your slide, it is an expression given to the psychological impression one has of intervals between two events of different magnitudes of those intervals. Right. So this is the best that we can do with respect to defining time. So it's just a psychological impression that we as individuals or community or society or religion come to have of the interval that separates two events. So it's completely psychological. It's all mental activity, and therefore we have cultural notions of time that differs from each other, right? And that is what created a lot of controversy, a lot of ambiguity, a lot of discomfort in understanding our past. When the British administrative historians came to India and tried to understand about India's past, they wanted to understand Indian notion of time. And Indian notion of time, they discovered to their dismay, was at variance with the Christian or European notion of time. Their own notion of time was undergoing fair degree of change at precisely the moment they came to India. That you can say conjecture where these things are happening around the last quarter of the 18th century or the early 19th century. We shall be talking about it as to how it impacted our understanding of history as such. Now, dragging back our discussion to what we were talking about, that is time, of course, we know that it doesn't have any beginning, nor does it have an end. So, one way to visualize it, that time is eternal, right? So, without beginning, without end, it is eternal, shashwat, right? Ever present. That kind of a thing. It flows only in one direction, from past to the future. Now, this is commonsensical understanding of time, very logically. This is how we are tuned to, look at time, that it moves from past to the future, and we can't go back in time. So, that is what we think so. But if you mathematically look at this, well, time can flow in reverse direction also. After all, we just discovered that it is a psychological notion, it is a psychological impression. So, you can put minus to all the equations with relation to time, and it can go in reverse direction as well, right? So, mathematically, theoretically, quite possible that you can reverse the direction of time from present to past as well, or from future to past as well. Now, there comes the big paradigm turner in natural sciences, in physics, and this is Einstein, who is credited to have done away with the dominance and hegemony of Newtonian physics of certitude. There was a time in 19th century when physicists believed that everything is fine in physics. They have come to know, and it is only about applying those equations, and by that they would one day be able to apprehend everything around them. So, they even gave this much of confidence to historians that they would one day be able to apprehend everything of past and write a total history. That was not to happen. In the initial decades of the 20th century, this man Einstein had arrived, and we all know about him, and the enormity of impact in terms of visualizing things around us, visualizing entities that resulted from Einstein's findings is simply phenomenal. At times it appears counterfactual and therefore somewhat difficult to visualize. But there he is, who completely redefined the way we look at several entities, including time. And Einstein says that time is the fourth dimension in which the universe exists. Right? So it is inseparable from space. It's one of the dimensions, and you can't pull it out of it. Right? It exists as a whole alongside space, and therefore it is inseparable from space. It is not absolute, but dependent on the frame of reference of the observer. This is what we come to know as the relativity. Right? It depends. I mean, how you are looking at time will depend on the subject who is observing it. It is not objective absolute truth in the sense that it exists over and beyond as a brute reality, brute absolute reality, independent of the observer. No. Einstein is saying that the frame of reference of the subject who is observing time is critical to visualization of time, and it is dependent on that. Right? And therefore, there is nothing absolute about time. Reference of the observer is important, is critical to looking at time, to view time. Right? Now, so having surveyed this kind of definitional aspect of time, mostly from the natural science perspective, let's come back to the domain of history. We all know that time, space, and human agency, they constitute the cutting edge of history, and you can't think of history in the absence of these three. Therefore, when we look at history with respect to what we just discussed about time, one can therefore visualize past not merely as something that once existed somewhere that needs to be read about, but also as past overspilling into the present and the future. So, past overspills into the present and is likely to overspill into the future as well. And therefore, it's not out there separated from the present and out there to be viewed, to be measured, to be understood, to be captured, to be apprehended. That's not the case. There is fair degree of continuum, and we all know that it expresses itself through numberless quotidian reenactments. So deep past, forget about the immediate past, even the deep past, for example, ancient India, medieval India, that is far separated from the present times, yet deep past lives. I'm quoting Thomas Trotman here, right? So, deep past lives in the present through numberless quotidian reenactments. Quotidian is everyday, usual reenactments, the way we talk, the way we visualize, the way we conceive of things, our mental predisposition, right? Our dress, our food, and so forth. So, it lives through our thoughts. It lives through our actions, iterations of words, concepts, ancient inventions, ways of doing things, from forms of reckoning, eating. Now, what is food for us? What is health for us? If you just ponder, Indian conceptualization of health would be a little bit different from the Western conceptualization of health, or for that matter, what food means to us, what worshipping means to us, what childhood means to us, what adulthood means to us, what birth means to us, what death means to us, what a particular word means to us. They are all bequeathed from past, and we are living with it. So the past is overspilling into us. The fears, there are several fears embedded in our unconscious and subconscious mind. We are not aware of it, but it acts. It goads our actions in a particular direction. Right, so they are very much there. Past is very much there, and it keeps influencing, guiding several actions even in the present times, and it will continue doing so in future as well. Right. So, when we think of it that way, we find that there are two tendencies about deep past of India that are born of the colonial studies, and this creates some kind of a paradoxical situation. Now, what are these two tendencies about deep past of India born of colonial studies is something that we shall be talking about, and this discussion might spill over to the next presentation also, because this is so critical, and it is as a consequence of this that we in the next part would be talking about whether ancient India had historical consciousness or not, because that was the charge made by the Orientalists or colonial administrators when they came to India and they started delving into Indian matters, Indian administration and so forth. They needed to know about India's past. And when they translated several texts of India's past, India's deep past, they came to some kind of a conclusion which was somewhat paradoxical. At times, they negated the presence of historical consciousness. At the same time, they used some of the tidbits acquired from that study about India's deep past in order to substantiate, resurrect their own conceptualization, the Christian or European conceptualization of time, and we shall be talking about it. So, these colonial studies that ensued, say around the beginning of the 19th century, and since all of us know that they were British administrators and they had their own colonial interest, imperial interest in governing India. So, whatever they wrote or understood or printed about India's past or propagated about India's past was so compromised on account of colonial interest. It was so much guided, influenced by colonial interest, that our idea of ancient Indian past became nothing but a mere back projection of colonial interests. So, this is one consequence that follows from the colonial studies. Further, the 19th century creation that it was, I'm talking of the conceptualization of history, the modern way of history writing with graduating chronology and fact-based accounts of past and so forth. We all know that the last quarter of 18th century and 19th century was enormously transforming times. Industrial revolution, French revolution, modernity, scientific revolution, rationality and so forth. It had impacted all walks of life. It had completely transformed the ancient regime into something very modern, be it polity, be it society, be it economy, be it religion. Right, be it thought processes, be it intellectual currents, right, be it the ways in which we know about things around us, disciplines and so forth. So, 19th century is the crucible where it is happening, and since the visualization of India's deep history, ancient past, is as a consequence of something that is happening at the behest of these colonial scholars, and this is being done in 19th century. Therefore, the 19th century being so discontinuous with the deep past that it had nothing significant to tell us about a completely transformed times that we live in. So, past was of little relevance in understanding a completely transformed scenario of 19th century and thereafter. This is what is the implication, and therefore a tendency developed that past has withered away. Past is of little consequence because we are living in a completely transformed times, and in these transformed times, past cannot lead us, cannot give us much of a clue. Now, the second tendency is that instead of shrinkage of the deep past, it rather is enlarged without limit. So, there is enthusiasm that okay, so if colonial studies have led to almost negation of deep past, so let's try to undo this. And in this enthusiasm, there is this tendency to magnify not the past in general, but its most ancient beginnings, and treat those beginnings as the charter myth of a nation and the nation state as their final destiny, because nation state is also the creation of this 19th century, right? And therefore past was used as some kind of a handmaiden to justify in a very teleological fashion that everything in history happened to result into the formation of nation state that we started having, particularly with respect to European history, and also India being part of the British colony, it had pertinence to this as well. Now, this tendency regards the deep past as drenched in significance for the present and the future. So, on the one hand, it is a kind of negation of history. The other hand, we have deep drenched significance of past for the present and the future. So, at one level, we find that the Oriental studies involved combination of the phonological and grammatical analysis of Sanskrit, in which most of the ancient Indian scripts and treatises were written, with the European techniques of eliciting historical relations among languages to produce findings that neither tradition anticipated. This resulted in Languages and Nations project. So, what I mean here is that set of Indo-Aryan languages, right? The affinity between the common origin of, say, English, Sanskrit, French, and several other European languages, right? And that kind of thing actually resulted from this intervention. At another level, British India was a site of clash of space-time framework. European conceptualization of origin of Earth being not more than 4,000 years before Christ, and we should understand this, right? We have the case of Nuremberg Chronicle, which probably was one of the earliest treatises written, in fact printed in Europe around 1493. It very neatly fitted all of the world history, future included, into a short chronology of a kind of cosmic week, each constituted of 1,000-year period. So, when we sat down to critique the Indian cyclic notion of time, and we think that, okay, this was nothing more than a fantasy and human creation, well, we should pause and think that even the Europeans at this point of time, as late as 18th century, were still struggling with this kind of a notion of, or this kind of a conceptualization of time, which ascribed the origin of Earth to not more than 4,000 years before Christ. And we all know what was happening 4,000 years before Christ. So, it was equally absurd, if not more, right? And this is what we will come to in the next series of lecture on this. That would be a sequel to this. So, be mindful of this discussion, and we will carry it over into the next part. Thank you.